if you can fight the war on cars in the Motor City, then you can fight it anywhere.
That's Doug Gordon. Today's question is, should the Motor City join the war on cars? Doug is the co-host of the popular podcast, The War on Cars, and in this episode from The Vault in April, we discuss something that's frankly insane to many in Metro Detroit. Should we be less dependent on the automobile? We like to explore different ideas on the show, so I hope this one at least makes you think a bit. This is your Daily Detroit for January 3rd, 2020. I'm Jer Stays. Monday, we get into our regular groove again when people get back from the holiday. We're going to have more news roundups. There's obviously a ton to talk about, and this gave our tiny team a little bit of rest. So we can't wait to bring you more information, more smart voices, and interesting conversations in the new year for your commute time, walk the dog time, shower time, or as one listener we know, the beer and dinner time. All right, without further ado, should Detroit join the war on cars? On the line from Brooklyn, Doug Gordon. How did you get involved into the war on cars?
So I am a safe streets advocate here in Brooklyn, and I've been approaching that from various different angles for about 10 years. I started a blog called Brooklyn Spoke many years ago, and I have a Twitter feed associated with that. But I've also been involved in on-the-ground safe streets fights for bike lanes and bike parking and bike share here in Brooklyn for all that time as well. And my co-host Aaron Naperstek and Sarah Goodyear, we had all kind of been talking about doing a podcast for quite some time. And there are transportation related podcasts out there, but they tend to be a little wonky. They tend to be filled with policy and jargon and are probably aimed towards people who are already well versed in the subject. And we wanted to do something that cut a little bit more towards the cultural aspect of cars and why cars are destructive to cities, and what we can be doing to break the habit of cars and break the influence of cars on our cities. And so the war on cars was the result.
When you go through this every single day, or on a regular basis, for you, it's every single week. Like for me covering this, it sometimes is maddening because when you put something out into the world, it seems like, especially when you deal with a mainstream audience, people are like, oh my God, I would never give up my car. And then someone like me, I'll just be honest, like I don't often drive. You can't do that in too many neighborhoods of Detroit, but it's something that's freeing. And in a city like Detroit, where we actually have the highest car insurance in the nation, one thing people may not realize is that it costs, $4,000 or $5,000 a year just to insure your car here.
Wow.
Which is pretty insane. The thing is that most people here, the average household income is just under 30 grand. So think about that for a second. If your average household income, and I do a little bit better than that, but the average household income in this city is 30 grand, yet it's $5 grand to insure your car. That's nuts.
It's madness. And you hit on something that we talk about on the podcast quite a bit, which is that with the exception of a few places in the United States, certainly where I live, where in Brooklyn, where there's good public transit and the subway and the bus, and you can walk to most places. Other places like San Francisco or Boston or parts of Chicago, where you're saying where you live in Detroit, if you want to live without a car and you have the ability to make that choice, you can. Certainly, we talk about this on the show as well. There are plenty of people with disabilities, with very low incomes who don't have a choice but to live without a car, no matter where they live. But that being said, what you hit on is exactly right. It's kind of madness that the ticket to entry to being a full participant in society in most places in North America is a car. Now, maybe you got a car for free. Someone gave you one. Like you said, you still have to pay thousands of dollars in insurance per year. You have to pay for gas. If something goes wrong and it's not covered by insurance, or even if it is and you have a high deductible, you're talking about a huge expense. All for what? So you can get to work, so you can get to school. That is, if you look at the history of humanity and try to just overlay our brief little time here of car history, that it's really madness that is what it takes. And the toll that it enacts on people's lives is quite extreme.
I think there's some irony in the idea that Henry Ford designed the automobile to free people so that they could go longer distances, so they could have, better connections with people. If you look at some of the stuff for what Henry Ford looked at when he was creating the Model T and what he believed in those kind of ways, and it created the exact opposite.
Yeah. The thing about cars is that their utility goes down the more people have one, right? If nobody in your neighborhood has a car, well, you can drive to work pretty easily on traffic free roads and you're never late to anything. But the more traffic there is, the more people on the road, the less useful driving becomes. That's the opposite of almost every other form of transportation you can imagine. The more people who bicycle in your city or town, the more useful typically and safe bicycling becomes. The more people who rely on the bus, then the bigger constituency there is for improved bus service, and buses become more reliable. So cars are just the opposite of all of that. Like the best thing you could do if you drive and have no other choice is to encourage all of your neighbors to get a bike. So that your drive to work is perfectly clear. But yeah, it's really the promise of freedom as exhibited in the early marketing by Henry Ford or even in car ads today is not the reality that we experience.
You spoke about bikes, and I want to get to a topic that is very popular, at least here at Daily Detroit, and something that people talk a lot about here. And then I heard on your podcast, you all talk about it in New York as well, bike lanes and the pushback around bike lanes. It's crazy how much bike lanes just get people riled up. And one of the things that I would add, because if anyone, I'll put a link into the show notes to this episode about the progressive push against bike lanes. And one of the things I thought was really interesting here is that the mayor of our city in Detroit actually said that the push against bike lanes was mostly not by city residents, but by suburbanites that wanted shorter commutes into the city, and that bike lanes provided other benefits such as slowing down traffic, and that people were actually walking with strollers along streets where that would never happen, not just because of that there were bikes there, but the bike lane created a buffer. And they're actually going to be doing sidewalk level bike lanes near my house, which is really, really exciting. But people lose their mind and they talk about it as some sort of thing that restricts them. What do you see? Why do you think that is? And how could people answer that?
Well, I think it all comes down to change. Change is very hard. When you live in a city or in any place for a long amount of time, you get used to the way things are. And we as humans are creatures of habit. So if someone comes along the city, a traffic planner, advocates, and they say, we want to change this street and we want to take the 3 lanes or 4 lanes of traffic that are on there now, remove 1 or 2 of those car lanes and put in protected bicycle lanes. I think our natural reaction as human beings is to say no, or to think about what could go wrong. So some of that is natural and to be expected. Where it goes off the rails is when people are blind to some of the benefits that you are talking about. You know, here in New York, they installed bicycle lanes on 8th Avenue and 9th Avenue in Manhattan. Those were kind of the first paired protected bicycle lanes in New York City. And they found that injuries to all users, not just cyclists, but pedestrians and drivers, went down by something like 20 or even 40%. And that was kind of lost on a lot of people because it was just seen as, oh, these bike lanes. So there's the change part of it. People are just naturally resistant to change. Then there's the other piece of it, which is that bike lanes kind of can get wrapped up in culture wars, which we talk about a lot on the podcast, in that every city in America is struggling with issues of gentrification, of equity, of race, of class. And, so a real estate developer comes in and puts up a big shiny glass condo in your neighborhood. There might not be much that you as a citizen feel that you can do about that because that developer went through all the proper channels. By the time you find out about it, maybe the building is halfway built. There's nothing you can do. But a bike lane goes in, and most of the time it's just paint on a street. And if you're not happy with all the changes that you see happening in your neighborhood, that's something that is easy to fight back against. And so I think that's another piece of it, is that this stuff gets wrapped up in all of these other issues that aren't always about the bikes or the bike lanes themselves. So this stuff is complicated, and it's messy, and change is happening very quickly, too quickly for some people. But that's what makes it kind of yeah, this kind of mad, weird, strange, outrage fueled, clickbaity sort of news that you see in a lot of media outlets.
One thing I think about with this whole bike lane controversy is people don't realize that more than a quarter of Detroit households don't own a car in the Motor City. We have a terrible transit system compared to, say, other metro areas. Although the city of Detroit itself is getting better, we still have huge gaps in the suburbs. So there's actually a large amount of people, but they're not on the internet, right? If they don't have enough money for a car, if they can't have enough money for, say, insurance, like we talked about earlier, people often have multiple jobs to juggle. 40% of Detroit households don't have access to broadband, either a hardline or even through a smartphone. So they're not sitting on social media all day.
Right. And nor are they necessarily the people who are going to have the time to show up to, say, a community meeting where this stuff is proposed, right? Here in New York, a lot of these issues are discussed at community board meetings in each sort of neighborhood. And those meetings are often held at, say, 6:30 on a weeknight. And if you're lucky and you have a flexible schedule or work is understanding and you can leave at 5:30 to make sure you get there on time to sign up to speak, great. You are going to get your 2 cents in and your voice is going to be heard as part of our democracy. But if you work a minimum wage job, if you don't have a flexible schedule, if you can't afford a babysitter, then your voice is not included at this stuff. So I think that part of the problem with talking about this stuff is that we have to ask, like, who's not in the room? Why are these loud voices as loud as they are? Typically, if you have something to lose, parking spaces, for example, you might be pretty motivated to show up or complain or write a letter to an editor. But if you don't yet know what you have to gain by the safety improvements of a bicycle lane that doesn't exist on your street yet, it's harder to motivate people to show up for something that doesn't exist yet. It's very easy to motivate people to do it if they feel like they have something to lose.
One of the things that I thought was cool about your project is that you have this Patreon and you ask people to enlist into the war on cars at different levels. So I have to ask this. Metro Detroit is kind of the crucible of car culture. I mean,
yeah.
We have the big three and everything else. Is there a compelling way or a compelling case you could make that Detroit should join the war on cars?
Well, so the funny thing about the title, and we sometimes get pushback on that, that title came from Rob Ford, who was the former mayor of Toronto. He's now deceased. His brother, however, right, is a big councillor in Ottawa. And when he was elected, one of the first things he did was basically say that the war on cars is over, because Toronto, like a lot of cities, as you know, like has this big split, much like Detroit, between the kind of suburban edges and outer city limits and the downtown urban core. And so he saw all the bike lanes and transit projects as this assault on cars, this war on cars. So we adapted and adopted that title for our own purposes. I would say, to answer your question about why should Detroit or any city like it enlist in the war on cars, it's like, look, cars enact a pretty terrible toll on our lives, even if we like cars. We have 40,000 people killed by automobiles every year. The majority of those are people in automobiles, not just pedestrians and cyclists. There's the environmental stuff. There's climate change and emissions, and something like a third of our emissions are transportation related, and the majority of that is from private automobiles. There's the economic argument, right? That if you can save $300-400 a month, like you said, insurance is really high in Detroit. I think the national average for car ownership, it costs something like $8,000 a year to own and operate a car. Why should anybody be burdened with that expense if they don't want to or have to? So there are so many compelling reasons to get behind it, and also just the quality of life. When you live in a place that's walkable, that's bikeable, where things are accessible on foot within reach of your apartment, then you know your neighbors. You see people who are familiar to you. Even if you don't know them by name, you are part of the same community. And that's not really possible when you're buzzing by each other at 55 miles an hour on the highway. So I think it's all of those things. There's so many compelling reasons to make cities better for people who aren't in cars.
Doug, I really appreciate your time today. Where can people find everything around your podcast?
So we are available anywhere you might get a podcast: Apple Podcasts, Overcast, all of that stuff, Spotify. We have a website, thewaroncars.org, and all the information and every episode and links to our Patreon campaign are up there as well.
And that'll do it for today's show. If you want to help support what we're doing, consider becoming a member for just a few bucks a month. It really makes a difference and let us cover stories in different ways than the "if it bleeds, it leads" soundbite, to focus on solutions instead of clicks. You can do that at patreon.com/dailydetroit. With that, I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and let's make a better Detroit together.